human footprints preserved in ancient mud, in a place where no humans were supposed to exist. In the deserts of New Mexico, these tracks have been dated to nearly 23,000 years ago, a time when massive ice sheets blocked any path into the Americas. According to everything we thought we knew, this should be impossible. And yet, the footprints are real, likely left by a mother and her children, walking across a vanished landscape. Ordinary people, in an impossible time. And if they were truly here that early, then it's not just the timeline that's wrong. It's the story of who the first Americans were. Let that sit for a moment. Not a single tool, not a broken spear point, not a scattering of charcoal from some ancient fire. Footprints, the most human evidence imaginable. Bare feet pressing into soft, wet ground. The place is called White Sands. Today it is a vast expanse of gypsum dunes in southern New Mexico. Blinding white sand stretches in every direction. The air is hot and dry. Almost nothing lives here now. But thousands of years ago, this place was unrecognizable. A great lake once filled this basin. Its shores were muddy and rich with life. Giant sloths wandered the edges. Mammoths came to drink, and among them walked people. We know this because of the mud. When someone steps into wet ground, the impression can harden quickly under the right conditions. Layer upon layer of sediment buries the track, and if nothing disturbs it, it can survive for millennia. That is exactly what happened at White Sands. Beginning around 2009, researchers started noticing strange impressions in the dried lakebed. At first, they were not sure what they were looking at. Wind and erosion had exposed shapes that looked almost too perfect. Then the shapes became unmistakable. Toes, arches, heels, human footprints, dozens of them, scattered across the ancient surface. Some were large, clearly adults. Others were tiny, children, perhaps toddlers carried on someone's hip and then set down briefly. One trackway in particular captured the world's attention. It appeared to show an adult, likely a woman based on the foot size, walking with a small child. The stride was purposeful. She was going somewhere specific. At certain points along the path, the child's prints appear beside hers. Then they vanish. She likely picked the child up. A few dozen meters later, the small prints reappear. She set the child down again. This is not abstract science. This is a mother carrying her child across a muddy lakeshore, perhaps 23,000 years ago. You can almost see her adjusting the weight on her hip. You can almost hear the soft sounds of bare feet in wet earth. But here is the problem. 23,000 years ago, according to the dominant scientific model, no human should have been anywhere near New Mexico. The entire northern half of the continent was locked under ice. Two enormous glaciers, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, covered most of what is now Canada. Where they met, they formed a barrier thousands of feet thick. No land route existed between Alaska and the rest of the Americas, or so we believed. The accepted theory said that humans first entered the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago. They crossed a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. Then they walked south through a narrow ice-free corridor that opened between the glaciers as the climate warmed. These people were known as the Clovis culture, named after a town in New Mexico where their distinctive spear points were first found. For decades, Clovis was considered the starting point. Everything in American prehistory began with them. Nothing came before. The footprints at White Sands shattered that idea. They did not predate Clovis by a few hundred years. They predated it by nearly 10,000 years. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a complete rewriting of the narrative. When the dating was first announced in 2021 by a team from the United States Geological Survey and several universities, the scientific community reacted with a mixture of astonishment and skepticism. The dates were based on radiocarbon analysis of seeds found within the footprint layers. Specifically, The researchers dated seeds from Rupia serosa, a type of aquatic plant that grew in the shallow waters of the ancient lake. These seeds were embedded in the same sediment layers as the footprints, directly above and below them. The results came back consistently. Around 21,000 to 23,000 years old. Multiple samples. Multiple layers. The dates held firm. And they placed human beings in the Americas during the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the last ice age. Some critics pushed back immediately. Radiocarbon dating of aquatic plants can sometimes produce errors. Water absorbs old carbon from dissolved minerals, which can make organic material appear older than it actually is. This is called the reservoir effect. The research team anticipated this criticism. They tested for it carefully. They compared the aquatic seeds with terrestrial pollen from the same layers. They also dated conifer pollen and other non-aquatic material. The results were consistent across different sample types. In 2023, a follow-up study confirmed the original dates using two additional methods. One involved radiocarbon dating of pollen from land plants. The other used a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures when quartz grains were last exposed to sunlight. All three independent dating methods converged on the same answer. Roughly 21,000 to 23,000 years ago, the footprints were real. The dates were real, and the implications were staggering. Think about what this means. During the coldest point of the Ice Age, when glaciers locked away so much water that sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, people were already living deep inside North America. They were not clinging to the edges of the continent. They were not huddled in some temporary refuge just south of the ice. They were in New Mexico, walking beside a lake, living among megafauna, raising children. This was not a fleeting visit either. The footprints span roughly 2,000 years of deposits, layer after layer of tracks from different time periods. People kept coming back to this lake, generation after generation, for centuries upon centuries. Whoever these people were, they were not passing through. They were home. This was their landscape. They knew its rhythms, its seasons, the movements of the animals that lived here. They were part of this ecosystem. And that raises the deepest question of all. If humans were here 23,000 years ago, how did they get here? The ice-free corridor was sealed. The land bridge alone could not explain their presence this far south. Something else must have happened. Some other route. Some other timeline. Some other story entirely. The footprints do not answer these questions. They only prove that the old answers were wrong. And that is perhaps the most unsettling thing about white sands. It does not give us a new theory. It simply destroys the old one. It leaves us standing at the edge of a mystery far deeper than we imagined. A mother and her child walked here, in the mud, by a lake, under a sky we will never see. And by doing something so ordinary, they changed everything we thought we knew about the peopling of an entire continent. But white sands was not the first crack in the old theory. Long before those footprints were discovered, the Clovis First model was already under siege. And the story of its collapse is almost as dramatic as the footprints themselves. Chapter 2. The Collapse of Clovis First. For most of the 20th century, one idea dominated the study of the first Americans. It was clean, it was simple, and it was wrong. The idea was called Clovis First, and for decades, questioning it could end a career. The story began in 1929 near Clovis, New Mexico. A teenager named Ridgely Whiteman discovered bones eroding out of a creek bank. Excavation revealed the remains of ancient bison alongside beautifully crafted stone spear points unlike anything seen before. These points were distinctive. They were fluted, meaning a long flake had been removed from the base on each side. This created a channel that made it easier to attach the point to a wooden shaft. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Radiocarbon dating, developed in the late 1940s, eventually placed the Clovis tools at roughly 13,000 years old. At the time, no reliably dated evidence of human presence in the Americas was any older. A theory took shape quickly. Humans had crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia during the last ice age, when lower sea levels exposed a wide plain connecting the two continents. They arrived in Alaska and waited. When the glaciers began to retreat, an ice-free corridor opened between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. The first Americans walked south through this corridor into the heart of the continent. They spread rapidly, hunting mammoths and mastodons. These were the Clovis people. They were the founders, the original Americans, and nothing came before them. This was the Clovis First model, and it became the bedrock of American archaeology for more than half a century. The theory was elegant. It explained the sudden appearance of sophisticated tools across the continent. It explained the timing, right after the ice began to melt. It even offered an explanation for the extinction of the megafauna. Some researchers proposed that the Clovis people were such efficient hunters that they wiped out the mammoths, the mastodons, the giant sloths, and dozens of other species within just a few centuries. This was called the overkill hypothesis. Clovis First became more than a theory. It became orthodoxy. Textbooks presented it as established fact. Funding agencies favored research that supported it, and anyone who challenged it faced fierce resistance from the archaeological establishment. This is important to understand. Science is supposed to welcome challenges, but science is practiced by human beings, and human beings form attachments to their ideas. Clovis First was not just a hypothesis. It was an identity for an entire generation of scholars. And then the cracks began to appear. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, at remote dig sites in places most people had never heard of. Archaeologists began finding things that should not have been there. The first serious challenge came from a place called Monte Verde in southern Chile. In the 1970s, a geology student named Mario Pino noticed unusual objects eroding from a creek bank near the town of Puerto Montt. Excavation revealed a remarkable sight. Preserved in a peat bog were the remains of a small settlement, wooden tent stakes, knotted cords, animal hides, medicinal plants, stone tools, even a single human footprint preserved in the clay near a hearth. The archaeologist Tom Dillihay led the excavation over many years. Radiocarbon dates placed the main occupation layer at roughly 14,500 years old. That was at least 1,000 years older than the earliest Clovis sites. The reaction from the Clovis First establishment was brutal. Dillahay's work was dismissed, attacked, and questioned at every turn. Critics argued the dates were wrong. They said the artifacts were not truly human-made. They questioned the stratigraphy. Dillihay endured years of professional hostility, but he continued his meticulous work. He invited skeptics to visit the site. He published exhaustive reports, and gradually the evidence became impossible to ignore. Monte Verde was real, and it was older than Clovis. In 1997, a group of prominent archaeologists, including some former skeptics, visited Monte Verde and examined the evidence firsthand. They concluded that the site was legitimate. The announcement sent shockwaves through the field. Clovis First had its first official crack. But if people were in southern Chile 14,500 years ago, the implications were enormous. Chile is at the bottom of South America. To reach it from Alaska, people would have needed thousands of years of migration. That meant humans must have entered the Americas much earlier than 13,000 years ago, possibly 15,000 years ago, maybe more. The clean Clovis timeline was suddenly impossibly compressed. Something did not add up. Other sites began to demand attention. In Pennsylvania, the Meadowcroft rock shelter had been producing radiocarbon dates older than Clovis since the 1970s. Its excavator, James Adavasio, faced the same kind of professional resistance that Dillihay experienced. Adivasio was meticulous. The stratigraphy at Meadowcroft was clear. Stone tools and evidence of human occupation extended back at least 16,000 years, possibly longer. But the Clovis First defenders found reasons to doubt every result. They suggested coal contamination had skewed the dates. They argued the stratigraphy was disturbed. For years, Meadowcroft was treated as an anomaly, an outlier to be explained away rather than a signal to be heeded. The pattern repeated itself across the hemisphere. Any site that claimed pre-Clovis occupation faced extraordinary scrutiny. The standard of evidence demanded was far higher than what was required for Clovis-age sites. The deck was stacked, but evidence has a way of accumulating. One anomaly can be dismissed, two can be debated. But when dozens of sites across two continents begin telling the same story, at some point the theory has to yield. By the early 2000s, the Clovis First model was in serious trouble. New dating techniques were confirming older dates at multiple sites. Genetic studies of living indigenous populations were suggesting deeper time depths. The walls were closing in. The final blow, or at least the most dramatic one, came from White Sands, 23,000 years. Not 1,000 years before Clovis, not 2,000. 10,000 years before Clovis. The model did not just crack, it shattered. Today, almost no serious archaeologist defends Clovis First in its original form. The debate has shifted entirely. The question is no longer whether people were here before Clovis. The question is how much before and how they arrived. But the collapse of a theory leaves a void. And into that void rush new questions, stranger possibilities, and sites that were once dismissed but now demand a second look. The Americas, it turns out, have been hiding secrets in plain sight. And some of those secrets are far older and far stranger than anyone imagined. Chapter 3. The sites that broke the timeline. Imagine you are an archaeologist. You have spent your career defending a clean, elegant theory of how humans first reached the Americas. Then, one by one, sites begin to emerge that make your theory impossible. This is what happened. It did not happen overnight. The sites accumulated over decades, scattered across two continents, each one adding another crack to the foundation. Individually, each could be questioned. Together, they told a story that could no longer be denied. We have already spoken about Monteverde in Chile and Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, but they were only the beginning. The Americas are vast, and the deeper researchers looked, the more they found evidence of people in places and times that defied explanation. Let us travel to Brazil. In the remote northeast, in the state of Piauí, there is a place called Pedra Furada. It is a massive rock shelter adorned with ancient paintings. Animals, human figures, geometric shapes, covering the walls in faded red pigment. The archaeologist Nied Gaiden began excavating here in the 1970s. She found what she believed were stone tools and charcoal from human-made fires in layers dating back 30,000 years or more. Some of her claims pushed dates to 50,000 years. The archaeological establishment reacted with predictable skepticism. Critics argued that the supposed tools were just naturally broken rocks that had fallen from the cliff above. They said the charcoal could have come from natural wildfires rather than human hearths. Gaiden defended her work fiercely. She pointed out that the charcoal was concentrated in distinct hearth-like features. The stone tools showed patterns of flaking consistent with intentional manufacture. And the paintings, while undated, suggested a long tradition of human presence. The debate over Pedra Furada continues to this day. Most researchers accept that the site has legitimate human occupation going back at least 20,000 years. The oldest claims remain controversial, but even the conservative dates push well beyond Clovis. Now move north to Mexico. In a cave called Chiquiyit, high in the mountains of Zacatecas, archaeologist Cyprian Ardelian led a team that uncovered nearly 2,000 stone tools buried in layers of sediment deep inside the cave. The tools were simple. Small flakes and cutting implements, not the elegant Clovis points, but their simplicity was part of the point. They represented a different technological tradition entirely, and their dates were extraordinary. Using radiocarbon dating and luminescence techniques, the team determined that some of the tools were between 26,000 and 30,000 years old. A few layers suggested possible human presence as far back as 33,000 years before the present. The study was published in the journal Nature in 2020, giving it significant scientific credibility. But it immediately drew criticism. Some researchers questioned whether the objects were truly tools or just naturally fractured stones. Others doubted the stratigraphic integrity. Ardolian and his team maintained that the evidence was solid. The tools showed clear signs of intentional flaking. The cave sediments were undisturbed, and the dates were supported by multiple independent methods. Chiquiwit, they argued, was real. Whether it ultimately wins full acceptance or not, Chiquiwit represents something important. It is one of a growing number of sites that suggest humans may have reached the Americas not just before Clovis, but long before the last glacial maximum. Travel further south to Argentina. At a site called Arroyo Seco, researchers found human remains alongside the bones of extinct megafauna, including giant ground sloths and a species of ancient horse. Stone tools were mixed into the same layers. Radiocarbon dates from Arroyo Seco placed the occupation at roughly 14,000 years ago. While not as dramatically old as some other sites, its location at the southern tip of South America implied a much earlier entry into the continent. Think about the geography. To walk from Alaska to Argentina requires crossing the entirety of North America, all of Central America, and nearly the full length of South America. Even generous estimates of migration speed require thousands of additional years. If people were in Argentina 14,000 years ago, they likely entered the Americas no later than 20,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. The math simply does not work with a 13,000-year-old entry date. Back in North America, the Galt site in central Texas added another piece to the puzzle. Located near the small town of Florence, Galt had long been known as a Clovis site. Thousands of Clovis points had been recovered from its upper layers. But when archaeologists Michael Collins and Thomas Williams dug deeper, they found something unexpected. Below the Clovis layers, in older sediment, they discovered a completely different set of stone tools. No fluting, different shapes, a different technology altogether. These tools were dated to between 16,000 and 20,000 years old. They were clearly human-made, and they had no connection to Clovis technology whatsoever. Whoever made them was part of an older, separate tradition that preceded Clovis by thousands of years. The Galt site was particularly significant because it was located in the heartland of Clovis archaeology. This was not some remote cave in another country. This was Texas. This was Clovis territory. And beneath the Clovis layers lay proof of something older. Another site that demands attention is the Topper site in South Carolina, along the banks of the Savannah River. Archaeologist Albert Goodyear excavated below the well-documented Clovis layers and found what he believed were simple stone tools in much older sediments. Some of the deeper layers at Topper have been dated to as much as 50,000 years ago using luminescence dating. These extreme dates remain highly controversial, but even the more conservative interpretations place human activity at the site well before Clovis. Then there is Bluefish Caves in the Yukon Territory of Canada. Here, archaeologist Jacques Cinquemars found bone tools and cut-marked animal bones in layers dating to roughly 24,000 years ago. For decades, his work was largely ignored or dismissed. Cinquemars spent years in professional isolation, convinced his evidence was sound but unable to convince his peers. He died in 2021, just as the White Sands discoveries were validating the kind of early dates he had championed his entire career. A re-examination of the Bluefish Caves material in 2017 confirmed that at least Some of the bone specimens show clear evidence of human modification. Cut marks made by stone tools were identified on horse and mammoth bones dating to 24,000 years ago. The pattern is unmistakable. From the Yukon to Chile, from Texas to Brazil, from New Mexico to Argentina, site after site tells the same story. Humans were in the Americas far earlier than the old models allowed. The evidence is converging. Each site has its critics. Each has its controversies. But the sheer number of independent lines of evidence pointing in the same direction makes it increasingly difficult to maintain that Clovis was first. The weight of evidence has shifted. And amid all these sites, one stands out for the clarity and emotional power of its evidence. Not because of tools or bones or charcoal, but because of something far more intimate. Footprints in the mud beside a vanished lake. White Sands is not just another data point. It is a window into a lost world. And that world, it turns out, was far more complex and far more alive than we ever imagined. Chapter 4. White Sands and the Lost World of Lake Otero. Close your eyes and imagine southern New Mexico 23,000 years ago. Forget the white gypsum dunes. Forget the dry desert air. What you see instead is water. A broad, shallow lake stretching across the basin, its surface reflecting clouds and sky. This was Lake Otero. It no longer exists. It vanished thousands of years ago as the climate shifted and the water slowly evaporated. But in its time, it was a center of life in a landscape that looked nothing like the one we know today. The shores of Lake Otero were soft and muddy. Grasses grew along the edges. Small streams fed into the basin from the surrounding mountains, which were greener then, covered with more vegetation than they carried today. The air was cooler. The region received more rainfall. The last glacial maximum had locked enormous amounts of water into the ice sheets to the north. But here in the south, the climate was wet enough to sustain a vibrant ecosystem. And what an ecosystem it was! The animal tracks preserved alongside the human footprints tell a remarkable story. Giant ground sloths, creatures that stood over 10 feet tall, left their massive prints in the same mud where humans walked. Columbian mammoths moved through the area, their enormous round footprints sinking deep into the soft ground. Dire wolves prowled the edges of the lake. Ancient camels, taller than their modern relatives, grazed on the vegetation. American lions hunted in the grasslands nearby. This was the Pleistocene world in all its staggering diversity. Megafauna dominated the landscape. Animals that seem mythical to us now were everyday presences for the people who lived here. Imagine looking up and seeing a mammoth at the waterline. The human footprints at White Sands are found across multiple layers of sediment, spanning roughly 2,000 years. This means people did not visit once and leave. They returned again and again, generation after generation, across an enormous stretch of time. Some of the trackways are remarkably long. One extends for over a mile. You can follow the path of a single individual across the ancient landscape, step by step, as if walking beside them through time. The variety of footprints tells its own story. Large adult prints, likely male. Smaller adult prints, probably female. And many children's prints. Teenagers, young children, toddlers. This was not a war party or a hunting expedition. This was a community. Families lived here. Children played along the lake shore while adults went about their work. You can see it in the tracks. Children's prints often appear in clusters, as if they were running, stopping, changing direction, playing, as children everywhere do. One of the most poignant trackways shows a young person, perhaps a teenager, walking in a straight line and then suddenly slipping. The footprints show the slide, the recovery, and the continuation of the walk. A small moment, frozen in time forever. The interactions between human and animal tracks are equally fascinating. In some places, giant sloth tracks and human tracks are found in the same layers, suggesting that people and megafauna were present at the lake at the same time. One trackway appears to show a giant ground sloth that changed direction after encountering human footprints. The sloth's tracks show it rearing up on its hind legs, perhaps to sniff the air or scan for danger before turning away. In another area, human tracks seem to follow the path of a giant sloth deliberately. The human footprints step inside the sloth's tracks as if someone was trailing the animal. Was this hunting? Curiosity? We cannot know for certain. But the implication is clear. Humans and megafauna were not just sharing the landscape passively. They were interacting. They were aware of each other. The people who lived at Lake Otero existed within a web of relationships with these enormous creatures. The preservation of the footprints is remarkable and somewhat accidental. The alkaline chemistry of the lake sediments helped harden the tracks. Layers of gypsum and other minerals sealed them over time, and the extreme dryness of the modern desert protected them from erosion. But there is an irony here. The very forces that preserved the footprints are now threatening to destroy them. As erosion exposes the ancient surfaces, the footprints are vulnerable to wind, rain, and human disturbance. Many tracks visible today will be gone within years. Researchers are working urgently to document as many footprints as possible before they disappear. Using photogrammetry, ground-penetrating radar, and other technologies, they are creating detailed three-dimensional maps of the trackways. A race against time, in more ways than one. The footprints have also revealed something unexpected about the people who made them. Analysis of the tracks suggests that many of the individuals were flat-footed, a common trait in populations that spend their entire lives walking barefoot on varied terrain. Step patterns suggest they were carrying loads. Some tracks are deeper on one side, indicating that the walker was bearing weight on a hip. Others show shortened strides consistent with moving through shallow water while carrying something heavy. These were not explorers venturing into unknown territory. These were people engaged in the daily work of survival, gathering resources from the lake, carrying water or food back to camp, tending to children, living their lives in an ordinary, extraordinary way. What did their camp look like? We do not know. No structural remains have been found near the footprints. The people who lived here likely used organic materials, wood, hides, woven plant fibers that decomposed long ago in the alkaline soil. Their stone tools, if they left any nearby, may still lie buried beneath the dunes. The White Sands area has not been extensively excavated for artifacts. The footprints were discovered on the surface, exposed by natural erosion. What lies beneath remains unknown. This is one of the great frustrations of White Sands. The footprints tell us the people were here. They tell us roughly when. They even give us glimpses of daily life. But they tell us almost nothing about who these people were. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they believed. We do not know what they looked like, though the footprint sizes suggest they were generally smaller in stature than modern Americans, consistent with many ancient populations. We do not know where they came from. If they arrived before the ice sheet sealed the corridor, they must have taken a different route entirely, perhaps along the Pacific coast, using boats to navigate past the glaciers, perhaps by some path we have not yet imagined. The coastal migration theory has gained significant support in recent years. The idea is that early humans traveled south along the Pacific coastline, moving from Siberia to Alaska to the coast of British Columbia, and then onward to the rest of the Americas. Much of that ancient coastline is now underwater, drowned by rising sea levels as the glaciers melted. Any evidence of coastal settlements would be submerged beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. This makes the coastal route extraordinarily difficult to prove directly, but indirect evidence supports it. Kelp forests along the Pacific coast would have provided a continuous corridor of food resources. Shellfish, fish, seals, and edible seaweed could have sustained travelers moving south. No ice-free corridor required. If this is correct, then the first Americans were not big game hunters marching through a gap in the glaciers. They were coastal people, maritime people. People who understood the sea and relied upon it. A completely different picture from the Clovis model. Lake Otero and White Sands may represent an inland expansion of these coastal populations. Having moved south along the coast, some groups eventually turned inland, following rivers and lake systems into the heart of the continent. By the time they reached New Mexico, they had already been in the Americas for thousands of years. They were not newcomers. They were established residents of a continent that most of the world would not know existed for another 20 millennia. The lake is gone now. The mammoths are gone. The giant sloths and dire wolves and ancient camels are gone. The people who left those footprints are gone. But the impressions of their feet remain, asking us questions we are still struggling to answer. And perhaps the most important question is one we have not yet fully addressed. If these people were here 23,000 years ago, and if Clovis people arrived 13,000 years ago, were they the same population? The same culture? The same lineage? Or were the people at White Sands something else entirely? A different wave of migration? A different origin? Could the Americas have been settled not once, but multiple times, by different groups taking different routes across thousands and thousands of years? The answer to that question lies not in footprints or stone tools, but in something far more intimate. Something carried in the blood and bones of every living descendant of those ancient travelers. The answer lies in DNA, and what the DNA reveals is perhaps the most surprising twist of all, because it suggests that the story of the first Americans is not one story. It is many stories, layered on top of each other, some of them leading to places no one expected. Chapter 5. The Kelp Highway into a New World. Think about the ocean. Not the ocean, you know. Not beaches with boardwalks and sunscreen. Think about the Pacific coast 20,000 years ago. Ice everywhere. Glaciers grinding down mountainsides into the sea. A world that looks completely uninhabitable. But look closer. Right at the edge where ice meets water, something extraordinary is happening. Kelp forests. Massive, dense, swaying underwater jungles stretching from Northeast Asia all the way down the Pacific coast. Thousands of continuous miles of biological richness. And within those forests, life. Unbelievable amounts of life. Sea otters, seals, fish in densities we can barely imagine today. Shellfish clinging to every rock surface. Sea urchins, crabs, seabirds nesting on rocky outcrops just above the tide line. A complete ecosystem, thriving in the shadow of glaciers. This is the Kelp Highway theory, and it changes everything. Remember the problem from earlier. The ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets did not open until roughly 14,000 years ago. But people were at White Sands 23,000 years ago. The math does not work. So how did they get there? For decades, the Clovis First model had a clean story. People walked from Siberia across Beringia, the land bridge exposed by lower sea levels. They waited for the ice sheets to part. They walked south through the corridor. Simple. Too simple, it turns out. The corridor, even after it opened, was not immediately usable. Studies of ancient pollen and sediment cores show that the landscape was barren for centuries after the ice retreated. No plants, no animals to hunt, no resources to sustain a migrating population. John Erlandson changed the conversation. An archaeologist at the University of Oregon, Erlandson spent years developing what he called the Kelp Highway hypothesis. His argument was elegant. You do not need an ice-free corridor if you never go inland. Instead, you follow the coast. Small groups in simple watercraft. Skinboats perhaps, similar to those used by maritime peoples across the Arctic for thousands of years. They would not need to cross open ocean. Just hug the shoreline, island hop, follow the kelp. The kelp forests created a continuous buffet. Every few miles you could stop, harvest shellfish, spearfish, club seals on rocky beaches. The caloric density of marine resources dwarfs anything available from inland hunting and gathering during an ice age. And the route was there, continuously. Even at the height of glaciation, the Pacific coast was not uniformly frozen. Research has identified ice-free refugia, pockets along the coast of British Columbia and southeast Alaska where glaciers never reached the water, small habitable zones. Rest stops on an ancient highway. Todd Brage and Erlandson published critical work in 2017. They mapped the distribution of kelp forest ecosystems along the Pacific Rim. The pattern was striking. From Japan to Kamchatka to the Aleutians to California, kelp forests formed an almost unbroken chain, a biological corridor connecting two continents. Think about what this means. You do not need a single dramatic migration event. You need small family groups, maybe a dozen people at a time, slowly expanding their range along a productive coastline, a few miles per generation. No grand expedition, just life, pushing gradually southward. The timeline works beautifully. If people began moving along the coast 25,000 years ago, even at an extraordinarily slow pace, they could have reached the Pacific coast of South America within a few thousand years. Some models suggest it could have happened much faster. But here's the devastating problem. Sea levels were 300 feet lower during the last glacial maximum. The coastline these people followed is now underwater. Their campsites, their middens, their tools, their bones, all of it submerged beneath hundreds of feet of Pacific Ocean. The evidence is there. We just cannot easily reach it. Some tantalizing fragments have survived. On the Channel Islands off California, archaeologists have found human remains and artifacts dating to 13,000 years ago. These are islands. You cannot walk to islands. Someone had boats. The Arlington Springs woman, found on Santa Rosa Island, her remains date to approximately 13,000 years before present. She's among the oldest human remains found in North America. And she lived on an island that required crossing miles of open water. She did not swim there. On San Miguel Island, researchers found incredibly sophisticated stone tools. Crescent-shaped bifaces unlike anything in the Clovis toolkit. Maritime adapted technology. Tools designed for a coastal life, not big game hunting on open plains. Daisy Cave on San Miguel Island tells another story. Excavations reveal layers of shellfish remains, fish bones, and seagrass cordage dating back over 11,000 years. People living sophisticated maritime lives. Processing marine resources with specialized knowledge. This was not desperation. This was expertise. Down in South America, the coastal evidence multiplies. At Huaca Prida in Peru, Tom DeLay, the same archaeologist who excavated Monte Verde, found evidence of maritime-adapted people dating back 15,000 years. Woven baskets, fishing nets, a community built entirely around ocean resources. The pattern repeats along the entire Pacific coast. Chile, Peru, Ecuador, California, Oregon, everywhere researchers look along the western edge of the Americas. The oldest sites cluster near the ancient coastline. The interior sites come later. The coast came first. But not everyone agrees the coast was the only route. Some researchers argue for multiple entry points. Perhaps some people did come through the ice-free corridor once it opened. Perhaps others crossed the Atlantic. Perhaps there were routes we have not imagined yet. And this is where the story gets strange. Because some of the evidence does not fit any conventional model. Not the coastal route. Not the interior corridor. Not any migration path that begins in Northeast Asia and moves east across Beringia. Some of the evidence points somewhere else entirely. What if the first Americans did not all come from Siberia? What if some of them came from a direction nobody expected? What if the Pacific coast was just one highway among several? The answers were about to challenge everything archaeologists thought they knew. Chapter 6. The strange theories no one could ignore. Dennis Stanford was a respected archaeologist at the Smithsonian Institution. He had spent decades studying Clovis points, those beautifully crafted stone tools that defined what Americans thought they knew about the first people in the hemisphere. Then he noticed something troubling. Clovis points have a very specific manufacturing technique, a characteristic called fluting, where a channel flake is removed from the base of the point. It creates a distinctive shape, elegant, functional, and supposedly unique to the Americas. Stanford started looking at European stone tools. Specifically, he looked at the Solutrean culture. These were Ice Age people who lived in what is now France and Spain, roughly 22,000 to 17,000 years ago. They made exquisite stone tools, thin, beautifully pressure-flaked bifaces. The resemblance to Clovis technology was unsettling. Stanford and his colleague Bruce Bradley published their theory in 2012. They called it the Solutrean hypothesis. The idea was explosive. Perhaps some of the earliest Americans had crossed the Atlantic, not the Pacific. Europeans in the Americas before Asians. The academic reaction was immediate and fierce. Critics pointed out obvious problems. The Atlantic Ocean during the Ice Age was brutal. Pack ice extended far south, but crossing thousands of miles of frozen ocean in primitive watercraft seemed impossible. The technological similarities could be coincidental. There was also a deeply uncomfortable political dimension. The idea that Europeans might have been first in the Americas had been co-opted by white supremacist groups almost immediately. This was not Stanford and Bradley's intent, but the damage was real. The hypothesis became toxic. The technological parallels were genuine. Independent lithic analysts confirmed that certain manufacturing techniques shared between Solutrean and Clovis. Toolkits were remarkably specific, not generic similarities. Detailed, step-by-step procedural matches that seemed unlikely to arise independently. Miles of ice-covered Atlantic separated the two cultures. But Stanford pointed to the Inuit. Modern Arctic peoples routinely travel enormous distances over sea ice. They hunt at the ice edge. They survive in conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. Maritime ice edge adaptation is real. Could Solutrean people have done the same? Theoretically, during the last glacial maximum, pack ice extended from Europe toward North America. The ice edge, like the Pacific Kelp Highway, would have supported marine mammals, seals, walrus, a traveling food supply for people who knew how to exploit it. The evidence, though, remained frustratingly thin. No Solutrean artifacts have been found in eastern North America with confirmed dates older than Clovis. No European Ice Age DNA has been identified in ancient Native American populations. The hypothesis hangs on technological comparison alone. Most archaeologists rejected it, but not all. And then came something even stranger. In 2017, a team working at the Cherubi Mastodon site in San Diego made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the field. They claimed evidence of human activity at the site dating to 130,000 years ago. Read that number again. 130,000 years, not 23,000, not 30,000. 130,000 years before present. A date so impossibly old that it would mean humans, or something like humans, were in the Americas before modern Homo sapiens even left Africa. The evidence consisted of broken mastodon bones. Specifically, the bones showed fracture patterns consistent with being struck by heavy cobblestones found nearby. The fractures were not random. They matched experimental patterns produced when researchers deliberately broke fresh elephant bones with stone hammers. Stephen Holen and Thomas Demmer led the study. Published in the journal Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific publications in the world. The peer review process was rigorous. The dating, done through uranium-thorium methods on the bone itself, was solid. The number was real. The interpretation was the problem. If humans were in the Americas 130,000 years ago, They were not modern humans. Homo sapiens had not yet migrated out of Africa in significant numbers at that date. So who broke those mastodon bones? The candidates were unsettling. Neanderthals had the cognitive capacity and the tool use. Denisovans were spread across Asia. Homo erectus populations persisted in Southeast Asia until relatively recently. Any of these species could theoretically have reached the Americas, but there was zero additional evidence. No stone tools that were clearly manufactured. No cut marks on the bones. No hearths. No other sites of comparable age anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Just broken bones and some rocks that might be hammerstones. The scientific community was deeply divided. Some researchers called it the most important archaeological discovery of the century. Others called it wishful interpretation of natural processes. Elephants fight. Bones break. Rocks fall. Nature can mimic human activity in disturbing ways. The debate remains unresolved. But the Cerruti site opened a door that could not be closed. It forced researchers to confront a possibility they had long dismissed. What if the Americas had been visited, perhaps briefly, perhaps unsuccessfully, by pre-modern humans long before Homo sapiens arrived? Meanwhile, another controversial theory was gaining traction. Australian researchers noted morphological similarities between ancient South American skulls and Aboriginal Australian populations. The oldest skulls found in Brazil, particularly from the Lagoa Sana caves, had features that did not match Northeast Asian populations. Walter Neves at the University of São Paulo spent years on this. He argued that the earliest South Americans resembled Australo-Melanesian populations more than they resembled modern Native Americans or Northeast Asians. The skull shapes were different. The facial structures were different. These looked like a completely separate population. How would Australo-Melanesian people reach South America? The mind reels. Across the Pacific? Along a southern route through Antarctica? The geographic challenges were even more extreme than the Solutrean hypothesis. And yet the morphological data was difficult to dismiss entirely. Then the DNA started talking. And what it said was more shocking than any of these theories. Because hidden in the genomes of living indigenous peoples and ancient bones pulled from the earth was evidence of something no one had predicted. Ghost populations, unknown lineages, phantom ancestors. The bones told one story. The genes told another. And they did not always agree. Chapter 7. Ghost humans in the DNA. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs. Within that vast molecular library sits a record of every migration, every marriage, every population split, every bottleneck, and every encounter between groups of humans stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. It is the ultimate archaeological site. And when geneticists finally gained the technology to read ancient DNA extracted from bones thousands of years old, the story of the first Americans cracked wide open. What emerged was far stranger than anyone had imagined. Start with what we thought we knew. The conventional genetic model, built through decades of mitochondrial DNA studies, suggested a relatively simple story. A single founding population left Siberia, crossed Beringia, and gave rise to all Native American populations. One source, one migration, one family. The first cracks appeared in 2012. A team led by David Reich at Harvard began analyzing genome-wide data from dozens of Native American populations across both continents. The results confirmed that most ancestry traced back to a single founding population from Northeast Asia, but not all of it. Deep in the genomes of certain Amazonian populations, the Sarui, the Caratiana, and the Xavanti, Reich's team found something that should not have been there. A genetic signal with no match in any known Northeast Asian population. It matched populations from a completely different part of the world, Australo-Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, the Andaman Islands. Remember Walter Neves and his skull measurements? The morphological data that everyone wanted to dismiss? The genetics were pointing in the same direction. Some ancient contribution from a population related to Australasians was present in South American DNA. They called it population Y. The Y stood for Ipacoira, a word from the Tupi language meaning ancestor. A ghost population, people whose physical remains had never been identified, whose archaeological footprint had never been recognized, but whose DNA lived on faintly in their descendants. How did Australo-Melanesian DNA get to the Amazon? This is where the story becomes genuinely bewildering. There is no obvious route, no clear mechanism, no archaeological trail connecting Australia or Melanesia to South America. And yet the genetic signal was there, replicated, confirmed, undeniable. Pontus Skoglund was among the first to identify the signal. Working with Reich, Skoglund published the finding in Nature in 2015. The statistical analysis was rigorous. The Australo-Melanesian affinity was not present in all Native American populations. It appeared only in specific South American groups. And it was old, very old. Several hypotheses emerged. Perhaps population Y represented an early coastal migration from Southeast Asia along the Pacific Rim. Perhaps they traveled a route completely separate from the main Barringen migration. Perhaps they arrived thousands of years before or after the primary founding population. Or perhaps the answer was even stranger. In 2018, a team analyzed DNA from ancient remains found at the Lagoa Santa caves in Brazil. These were the same skulls Walter Neves had studied for their Australo-Melanesian morphology. The bones were approximately 10,000 years old. The DNA told a complex story. The Lagoa Santa individuals were primarily descended from the same founding population as other Native Americans. Northeast Asian ancestry dominated their genomes. But that faint Australo-Melanesian signal was there too, woven into their genetic fabric like a thread from another world. The skulls looked Australo-Melanesian. The DNA was mostly not. This created a paradox. How could people look like one population, but be genetically descended primarily from another? The answer likely involves natural selection and genetic drift acting on skull morphology independently of overall ancestry. Appearance can be deceiving, but the ghost signal remained real. And population Y was not the only phantom ancestor hiding in American DNA. In 2019, a study of ancient remains from the Upward Sun River site in Alaska revealed another surprise. An infant buried 11,000 years ago belonged to a previously unknown population. They named her Ancient Barringen. The child's DNA showed that her people had split from the ancestors of all other known Native Americans. They were a distinct branch, a separate lineage that had occupied Beringia and then vanished, leaving almost no descendants among modern populations. Think about what this means. The Americas were not settled by one group in one wave. Multiple distinct populations entered the hemisphere at different times, perhaps by different routes. Some thrived, some vanished. Some left genetic traces so faint that only modern technology could detect them. The ghosts kept multiplying. In 2021, a comprehensive study of ancient South American genomes revealed yet another unidentified ancestral population. This one had no clear connection to any known group. Not Northeast Asian, not Australo-Melanesian, not Ancient Barringen. Something else entirely. The researchers called it unsampled population, a placeholder name for an entire civilization of people whose existence was inferred purely from statistical patterns in the DNA of their distant descendants. No bones, no tools, no sites, just mathematical echoes in the genomes of people living thousands of years later. How many ghost populations are hiding in American DNA? We do not know. Every new ancient genome sequenced seems to reveal another layer of complexity, another branching point, another population that split off, migrated, mixed, or disappeared. The simple story of one migration is thoroughly dead. And then came the most disturbing finding of all. In 2010, a finger bone found in Denisova Cave in Siberia yielded DNA from a previously unknown species of human, the Denisovans, not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthal, something else. A ghost species known almost entirely from their DNA rather than their fossils. Denisovan DNA is present in modern humans, particularly in populations from Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and Aboriginal Australia. When modern humans encountered Denisovans, they interbred. The offspring survived. Denisovan DNA was incorporated into the Homo sapiens genome and passed down through generations. Now follow the thread. If Denisovan DNA exists in Australo-Melanesian populations, and Australo-Melanesian DNA exists in certain South American populations through population Y, then Denisovan genetic material made it to the Americas. Ancient non-human DNA carried unknowingly by human migrants across the Pacific. But some researchers think the Denisovan connection goes deeper. Studies of high-altitude adaptation in Native American populations have identified genetic variants that may trace back to Denisovan ancestry. The ability to thrive at extreme elevations in the Andes might be partially inherited from a species of human that went extinct 50,000 years ago. The first Americans carried ghosts inside them. Not metaphorically, literally. Fragments of DNA from extinct human species woven into their chromosomes, helping them survive in environments their Denisovan ancestors never saw. The Andes, the Amazon, the Arctic. Adaptation powered by ancient interbreeding. And here's where the title of this documentary becomes relevant. When we say the first Americans were a totally different species, we do not mean they were aliens. We mean that the people who first walked into the Americas carried within them the genetic legacy of multiple human species. Sapiens, Denisovan, possibly Neanderthal, possibly others we have not identified. They were us, but they were also something more, something older, something we are only beginning to understand through the molecular archaeology of their genomes. Every ancient bone pulled from American soil has the potential to reveal another ghost, another lineage, another chapter in a story far more complex than we ever imagined. S.K. Willerslev has been at the center of this revolution. The Danish geneticist has sequenced more ancient American genomes than perhaps anyone alive. Each one has complicated the picture further. Each one has revealed that the peopling of the Americas was not a single event but a process. Messy, overlapping, human. So where does this leave us? We have footprints in New Mexico from 23,000 years ago. We have coastal migration routes along kelp highways. We have ghost populations appearing and disappearing from the genetic record. We have Denisovan DNA helping people breathe in the Andes. The old story is gone. The new story is still being written. But there is one question that towers above all others. One mystery that no amount of DNA analysis or radiocarbon dating has fully answered. It is the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night and geneticists arguing at conferences. If the first Americans were already in the hemisphere 23,000 years ago, genetically complex, carrying the legacy of multiple human lineages, adapted to environments from ice sheets to tropical forests, then we need to ask something fundamental. What happened to them? Because when the Clovis culture appears 13,000 years ago, it spreads like wildfire across North America. Identical tools from coast to coast. A sudden dramatic cultural explosion. And the people who made those tools do not genetically match all of the ghost populations. Some of the earliest Americans simply vanish from the record. Their DNA fades. Their tools disappear. Their footprints, like those at White Sands, are buried under layers of sediment and time. An entire chapter of human history, possibly spanning tens of thousands of years, goes silent. Were they absorbed into later populations? Were they replaced? Did climate change destroy their world? Did something else, something we have not yet considered, erase them from the story of the Americas? The answer lies buried in the ground. In caves we have not opened, in genomes we have not sequenced, in sites submerged beneath oceans we have barely explored. And what those sites will reveal may force us to rewrite not just the history of the Americas, but our understanding of what it means to be human. The ghosts are not finished speaking. Chapter 8. The Skull Wars of Ancient America in 1999. A Brazilian physical anthropologist named Walter Neves made a claim that would haunt American archaeology for decades. He had been studying skulls. Not just any skulls, ancient ones, 10,000 years old, pulled from the limestone caves of Lagoa Santa in southeastern Brazil. And they looked wrong. Wrong, that is, if you believed the standard model. The model that said all Native Americans descended from a single migration of Northeast Asian people crossing Beringia. The model that said they all looked fundamentally alike. These skulls did not look like modern Native Americans. They were long and narrow. The faces were projecting rather than flat. The eye sockets were low. The cheekbones receded instead of flaring wide. Neves measured them obsessively. He ran the numbers through statistical programs designed to compare skull shapes across global populations. And the results pointed somewhere unexpected. The closest matches were not East Asian populations. They were Australo-Melanesian populations, Aboriginal Australians, Papuan New Guineans, the indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia. Neves called these ancient Brazilians the Paleoamericans. He argued they represented a completely different founding population, a people who arrived first, long before the ancestors of today's Native Americans. Then those ancestors arrived, and the Paleoamericans vanished. It was a dramatic claim, and it landed like a grenade. Think about what he was suggesting. Two separate founding populations. Two separate migrations, possibly tens of thousands of years apart. The first Americans looking nothing like the people who eventually replaced them. The implications were enormous and politically explosive. Because if the earliest Americans were not the ancestors of living Native Americans, then who had the stronger claim to the land? Who counted as truly indigenous? This was not abstract philosophy. This was a legal and moral minefield. The most famous battle had already been raging for years. It centered on a single skeleton found in 1996 along the banks of the Columbia River in Kennewick, Washington. Kennewick Man, 9,300 years old. One of the most complete ancient skeletons ever found in North America. And from the moment physical anthropologists examined him, the controversy erupted. James Chatters, the first scientist to study the remains, noted that the skull appeared Caucasoid in its features. Not modern Native American. The face was narrow and long, the chin prominent. The press went wild. Suddenly, the narrative was not about Australian connections. It was about European ones. Cable news asked breathlessly whether white people had been in America first. This was exactly the wrong conclusion. Caucasoid is a morphological classification, not a racial one. It describes skull shape, not skin color or continental origin. But nuance does not survive cable news. 5 Native American tribes, led by the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation, immediately claimed the remains under NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. They wanted him reburied. He was their ancestor, they said. He deserved rest and respect. A group of scientists sued. They wanted to study him. They argued he was too old to be confidently linked to any living tribe, and that his unusual morphology demanded investigation. The lawsuit lasted 9 years. 9 years of legal briefs and appeals, and bitter accusations on both sides. Scientists called it censorship. Tribes called it desecration. Meanwhile, the skull measurements kept accumulating. Not just Kennewick Man, not just Lagoa Santa, Spirit Cave Mummy in Nevada. Over 10,000 years old. Long, narrow skull. Bull woman in Idaho, over 12,000 years old. Similar morphology. Pennon woman in central Mexico, nearly 13,000 years old. Same pattern. A picture was forming. The earliest American skulls consistently looked different from later populations. They were longer, narrower, more projecting. They matched global populations that nobody expected. Neves published paper after paper. He proposed that the Americas were settled in two major waves. The first wave, the Paleo-Americans, had Australo-Melanesian affinities. The second wave, ancestral to modern Native Americans, arrived later with classic Northeast Asian features. He was not alone. Other researchers saw the same patterns. The morphological evidence seemed overwhelming. But there was a problem. Skull shape is not a reliable indicator of ancestry. Physical anthropologists had known this for decades, but the implications had not fully penetrated the field. Cranial morphology is influenced by diet, climate, genetic drift, developmental plasticity, and random variation. Populations can converge on similar skull shapes without being related at all. Two groups can look alike and share no recent ancestry. Two groups can look nothing alike and be close cousins. This is not speculation. It is demonstrated biology. The classic example is the Ainu people of Japan. For over a century, Western anthropologists classified them as Caucasoid based on their facial hair, light skin, and deep-set eyes. Genetic analysis later proved they are deeply East Asian. Appearance deceived. And this is skulls we are talking about. Dry bone, stripped of all the living tissue that carries most of the variation we see in human faces. Measuring skulls and comparing them to global databases was 19th century methodology dressed up in 20th century statistics. It felt rigorous. The numbers were real. But the interpretive framework was flawed. Neves believed the numbers. Many scientists believed the numbers. The press absolutely believed the numbers because the story was irresistible. Ancient Americans who looked Australian. A vanished first people replaced by a second migration. Drama, mystery, loss. But the skulls could not answer the question everyone was actually asking. Were the first Americans a different people? Only DNA could answer that. And DNA was about to change everything. The Kennewick Man case reached its climax not in a courtroom, but in a laboratory. In 2015, a team led by Danish geneticist Eske Willerslev successfully extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from the skeleton. The results were unambiguous. Kennewick Man was genetically closest to modern Native Americans, specifically to the Colville tribe, one of the groups that had fought to rebury him. Not European, not Australo-Melanesian, Native American. The skull shape had been misleading all along. In 2017, the remains were repatriated and reburied in a private ceremony attended by representatives of the 5 claimant tribes. The skull wars were over. Or at least, that particular battle was. But the deeper question remained. If Kennewick Man was Native American despite his unusual skull, what about the Lagoa Santa people? What about Spirit Cave? What about all those early skulls that looked so different? Were they all misleading? Or was something more complex going on? The skulls had pointed toward a real mystery. They just could not solve it. For that, science needed a different kind of evidence. Evidence written not in bone, but in base pairs. In nucleotides. In the double helix itself. The answer was coming. And it would be stranger than anyone predicted. Chapter 9. What genetics finally revealed. Let us talk about ancient DNA. Not the DNA of living people, though that matters enormously. Ancient DNA, extracted from bones thousands of years old. Sequenced in clean rooms where scientists wear full bodysuits to avoid contaminating samples with their own genetic material. This is painstaking work. Brutal work, honestly. Ancient DNA degrades. It fragments into tiny pieces. It gets contaminated by soil bacteria, by fungi, by every archaeologist who ever touched the bone without gloves. For decades, it was essentially impossible to work with. The technology did not exist. The bones were too old, too damaged, too compromised. Then the technology caught up. Next-generation sequencing changed everything. Instead of needing long, intact stretches of DNA, researchers could work with millions of tiny overlapping fragments and computationally reassemble them into complete genomes. Suddenly, bones that had been sitting in museum drawers for decades became treasure troves. And the man at the center of this revolution was David Reich. Reich is a geneticist at Harvard. His lab has sequenced more ancient human genomes than any other facility on Earth. His work has rewritten the history of human migration on every continent. When he turned his attention to the Americas, the old models crumbled. Here is what the genetics revealed. Pay attention, because this gets complicated. But it is worth it. All Native Americans, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, descend from a single founding population that split from East Asian groups roughly 25,000 years ago. That split happened somewhere in Northeast Asia, probably Siberia. The founding group became genetically isolated, possibly stranded in Beringia during the last glacial maximum when ice sheets made movement impossible. This period of isolation lasted thousands of years, long enough for the population to develop a distinctive genetic signature found in every Native American group alive today. Geneticists call this the standstill model. The idea that the ancestors of all Native Americans spent millennia stuck in Beringia, cut off from both Asia and the Americas, waiting for the ice to open. Then they moved south, rapidly. Within a few thousand years, their descendants had reached the southern tip of South America, a journey of over 10,000 miles. That much was expected. It confirmed the broad outlines of what archaeologists had already proposed. But the details were staggering. The founding population was not homogeneous. It carried genetic contributions from at least two distinct Asian source populations: ancient North Eurasians and East Asians. The ancient North Eurasian component was identified through a remarkable discovery. In 2014, researchers sequenced the genome of a boy who died 24,000 years ago near Lake Baikal in Siberia. The Malta boy. His DNA showed he belonged to a population related to both modern Europeans and modern Native Americans. Not because Europeans came to America, but because a deep ancestral population in Siberia contributed genes to both lineages. The family tree was far more tangled than anyone imagined. But that was just the beginning. Remember those Lagoa Santa skulls? The ones Walter Neves said looked Australo-Melanesian? In 2018, Reich's team sequenced ancient DNA from those exact skulls. The results shocked everyone, including Reich. The Lagoa Santa people were genetically Native American. Fully, unambiguously Native American. Their DNA showed no special connection to Australo-Melanesian populations. The skull shape had been completely misleading. But here is the twist. In that same 2018 paper, the team found something else. Something they had not expected. A statistical signal buried deep in the genomes of certain living Amazonian groups. The Sarui, the Caritiana, the Xavante. These populations carried a tiny but unmistakable genetic signature that linked them to Australo-Melanesian populations, Aboriginal Australians, Papuan New Guineans, the Andamanese Islanders. Neves had been wrong about the skulls, but he had been right that an Australo-Melanesian connection existed. It was just invisible to the eye. You could not see it in bone, only in DNA. The team called this ghost lineage population YY for Ipaquera, a Tupi word meaning ancestor. Population Y has never been found in any ancient skeleton. No archaeological site has been identified with this group. They exist only as a statistical trace in the genomes of their living descendants. A ghost population, real enough to leave genetic evidence, invisible to every other method. How did Australo-Melanesian DNA get into Amazonian populations? Nobody knows for certain. The leading hypothesis is that a small group carrying this ancestry entered the Americas very early, possibly as part of the initial founding migration or shortly after. They were absorbed into the larger population. Their physical appearance vanished through admixture within a few generations, but their DNA persisted, diluted but detectable in certain isolated groups. Meanwhile, Pontus Skoglund, a Swedish geneticist working independently, confirmed the signal and refined it. The Australo-Melanesian contribution was real but small, perhaps 2 to 3% of the genome in affected populations. Enough to detect, too little to see on a skull. Then came another ghost. In 2019, a team analyzing ancient DNA from sites across North and South America identified yet another uncharacterized ancestral group. They called it unsampled populationa. This group contributed DNA to some of the earliest known Native American lineages, but matched no known population, ancient or modern, anywhere in the world. It was a phantom, a population that clearly existed because their genes survived. But no bones, no tools, no sites have ever been attributed to them. 2 ghost populations, at minimum, and there was more. Remember the Upward Sun River site in Alaska? In 2018, Willerslev's team sequenced the genome of an infant girl who died there 11,500 years ago. She belonged to a previously unknown population that the team named the ancient Beringians, genetically distinct from all other known Native American groups, a separate branch of the family tree that split from the main line before the southward migration. The ancient Beringians did not contribute significantly to any surviving population. They were a dead branch, a population that lived, thrived briefly in Alaska, and then disappeared. Another ghost. The genetic picture was becoming extraordinarily complex. Not one migration, but multiple pulses. Not one founding population, but several, some of which left descendants and some of which vanished entirely. And then there was the Denisovan signal. Denisovans were an archaic human species closely related to Neanderthals. They were identified entirely through genetics, first from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave in 2010. All non-African modern humans carry some Neanderthal DNA, but Denisovan DNA is distributed differently. It is most concentrated in Melanesian and Southeast Asian populations, and in some Native American groups, particularly in South America, particularly in highland populations, particularly in the Andes. A 2014 study found that certain Denisovan gene variants in Andean populations are associated with adaptation to high altitude, the same variants that help Tibetans survive at extreme elevations. This means the earliest Americans may have carried Denisovan DNA from their time in Asia, and that DNA may have helped their descendants colonize one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Ancient interbreeding between species, tens of thousands of years in the past, still shaping human biology today. Let that settle for a moment. The genetics had demolished the simple story. There was no single migration, no clean narrative of one people walking across one land bridge and populating 2 continents. Instead, there were waves, pulses, ghost populations appearing and vanishing. Ancient DNA from extinct human species woven into the fabric of living people. The genome was a palimpsest, layer upon layer of history written over itself, and scientists were only beginning to read it. But the central question remained, the one from the title, the one that had been building across every chapter. Were the first Americans a different species? The answer was finally within reach. Chapter 10. Who the first Americans really were here is the truth. The first Americans were not a different species. They were Homo sapiens, fully modern humans, anatomically, cognitively, behaviorally identical to you and me. Let that land, because the title of this documentary promised something dramatic, a totally different species. And in the strictest biological sense, that is not what the evidence shows. But stay with me, because the reality is far more extraordinary than a simple species distinction. The reality involves a depth of human complexity that makes the species question seem almost quaint. The people who left footprints at White Sands 23,000 years ago were modern humans. Their feet were shaped like ours. Their stride length, their toe impressions, their gait patterns all fall within the normal range of Homo sapiens variation. The children who played at the edge of that ancient lake were human children. Full stop. But what kind of humans? They carried in their genomes the legacy of interbreeding with at least two archaic human species. Neanderthals, whose DNA still influences our immune systems and pain sensitivity. Denisovans, whose genetic gifts may have helped their descendants breathe thin mountain air. They were Homo sapiens, yes. But they were Homo sapiens who had absorbed fragments of other human lineages now long extinct. They carried within them the genetic memory of species that no longer walk the earth. In a very real sense, they were hybrid beings, not a different species. Something more interesting. A mosaic. And their diversity was staggering. The founding population that crossed into the Americas was not a uniform group marching in lockstep. It was a collection of lineages that had spent thousands of years mixing and splitting and remixing in Beringia and Northeast Asia. Some carried more ancient North Eurasian ancestry. Some carried more East Asian. Some carried the mysterious signal that would later be identified as population. Why? Some carried the genetic fingerprint of unsampled population, A. They were, genetically speaking, already a complex mixture before they ever set foot in the Americas. And they did not arrive all at once. The evidence now supports multiple entry events spread across thousands of years. Some came by the Pacific coast, following kelp forests and marine resources southward. Some came later through the ice-free corridor when it finally opened around 14,000 years ago. Some may have come by routes we have not yet imagined. Each wave carried its own genetic signature. Each wave encountered or did not encounter the people who came before. Some mixed. Some replaced. Some vanished without explanation. The ancient Baringians stayed in Alaska and disappeared. Population Y spread south and was absorbed into Amazonian groups. Unsampled population A left its trace and faded from view. Layer after layer after layer. And here's where the story becomes genuinely haunting. Most of these early populations left no descendants. Or they left descendants so thoroughly mixed into later populations that their distinct identity was erased. They survive only as statistical ghosts in the genomes of living people. Imagine that. Entire peoples with their own languages, their own stories, their own ways of understanding the world, reduced to a fractional percentage in someone else's DNA. We will never know their names. We will never hear their songs. We will never know what they called the mountains or the rivers or the stars. But they were here. The DNA proves it. They hunted mammoths and giant sloths. They gathered plants we can no longer identify. They watched volcanic eruptions and survived ice ages and raised children who raised children who raised children for hundreds of generations. And then they were gone, absorbed, replaced, erased by climate catastrophe or conflict or simple demographic swamping as larger later populations expanded across the continents. What happened to them? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. Climate change certainly played a role. The end of the last ice age, around 11,700 years ago, triggered massive environmental upheaval. Sea levels rose dramatically, coastlines shifted. Entire ecosystems collapsed and reformed. Megafauna went extinct. The mammoths, the mastodons, the giant ground sloths, the saber-toothed cats. All gone within a few thousand years. And with them went the ecological foundation that many early populations depended on. The people who had adapted to Ice Age conditions suddenly found themselves in a different world. Some adapted. Some did not. But climate alone cannot explain everything. The genetic evidence suggests active population replacement in some regions, later groups expanding and outcompeting earlier ones. Not necessarily through violence, though violence certainly occurred throughout human history. Sometimes it is just numbers. A larger population absorbs a smaller one through intermarriage over a few centuries. No war required. Just demographics. The Clovis culture may represent one such expansion event. 13,000 years ago, Clovis technology appears across North America with stunning speed. Within a few hundred years, the same distinctive fluted points are found from coast to coast. That kind of rapid spread suggests either a fast-moving population or fast-moving technology. Probably both. And after Clovis, the archaeological record becomes more diverse, not less. Regional cultures proliferate. Adaptations specialize. The homogeneity of Clovis gives way to extraordinary variety. This is what population expansion looks like. A wave passes through, establishes a baseline, and then diversifies as people adapt to local conditions. The pre-Clovis populations, the White Sands people, the Monte Verde people, the unknown groups who left tools at Galton Meadowcroft and Bluefish Caves, were likely caught in this wave. Some survived by merging. Some were pushed to the margins. Some simply faded. But their DNA endured. Fragments of it, anyway. Woven into the genomes of the people who came after. So who were the first Americans, really? They were pioneers of almost incomprehensible courage. They crossed landscapes that would terrify modern mountaineers. They navigated coastlines in watercraft we cannot even reconstruct. They survived temperatures and conditions that would challenge anyone alive today. They were not a different species, but they were a different kind of us. A kind shaped by ice and isolation and interbreeding with ancient cousins. A kind that carried within them the genetic legacy of multiple human lineages. A kind whose diversity we are only beginning to comprehend. The title asked whether the first Americans were a totally different species. The answer is no. And also, in a deeper sense, it does not matter. Because what they actually were is more remarkable than any species label could capture. They were the vanguard of the most improbable migration in human history. Homo sapiens walking into a world that no human had ever seen. 2 continents, empty of people, filled with animals that had never learned to fear a bipedal predator. Everything that followed, every civilization, every language, every cultural tradition of the indigenous Americas, traces back to those first footsteps, including the ones at White Sands, a teenager walking through mud 23,000 years ago. A child on their hip, going somewhere, coming from somewhere. We do not know where. We do not know why. We only know they were here. And that changes everything we thought we knew about our species and its capacity for exploration and survival and sheer stubborn persistence. The first Americans were not a different species. They were us, at our most extraordinary. And yet, the story is not finished. Somewhere beneath the Pacific, drowned beneath 300 feet of risen sea, there are coastlines that humans walked 20,000 years ago. Caves where they sheltered. Hearths where they cooked. Middens where they discarded shells and bones. We have never seen these sights. We may never see them. The ocean holds its secrets with terrible patience. Somewhere in the unsequenced genomes of isolated indigenous communities, there are genetic signals we have not yet detected. More ghost populations. More phantom lineages. More evidence of migrations and mixtures that will force us to redraw the map yet again. Every year, new technology pushes the boundaries of what we can recover. Environmental DNA from cave sediments. Protein analysis from fragments too degraded for genetic sequencing. Satellite imaging that reveals buried structures invisible from the ground. The next White Sands is out there. The next discovery that rewrites the timeline. The next set of footprints preserved in ancient mud, waiting for the wind to uncover them. And here's the deepest paradox. The more we learn about the first Americans, the more we realize how much has been permanently lost. Languages that encoded thousands of years of ecological knowledge. Oral histories that map migrations we can only guess at. Ways of being human that vanished before anyone thought to record them. We are reconstructing the story of the first Americans from fragments. Bone fragments, DNA fragments, stone fragments. But fragments, assembled with patience and honesty, can reveal extraordinary truths. 23,000 years ago, a young person walked through mud beside a lake in what is now New Mexico. They carried a child. They left footprints. And those footprints survived everything. Ice ages and extinctions and the rise and fall of civilizations and the slow, patient burial of time. They survived to tell us something we desperately needed to hear. That we have been here longer than we knew. That we are more complex than we imagined. That the story of our species is deeper and stranger and more beautiful than any single narrative can contain. The first Americans were not a different species. They were us. And we are still just beginning to understand what that means. If this story changed the way you see human history, subscribe to our channel. The next chapter is already being written beneath our feet.